She is 84 years old. For decades, she has lived quietly, remaining mostly out of sight. A mother. A woman who raised her children in that steady, unassuming way that rarely makes headlines. The kind of woman you would never expect to find sitting at the center of a story like this. But here she is, and she is finally talking. For years, people close to Savannah Guthrie's family have known that something sat beneath the surface. Something unspoken. Not scandal, not in the tabloid sense. Something older than that. Something heavier. The kind of thing a family carries for so long that it becomes part of the air inside the house. Present in every room, though never once named out loud. The mansion. That's where it begins. That's always where it begins. A property with history. A property with walls that have heard things they were never meant to hear. And an elderly woman, now in the last chapter of her life, who has decided that silence has cost enough. What she says changes how you see everything that came before it. Not just about Savannah. Not just about the family, but about the quiet agreements we make with the people we love, about the things we protect. About the price of keeping a secret so long that you forget why you started keeping it in the first place. She waited until she was 84 to say it. That alone should tell you something. There are people in this world who live their entire lives just slightly out of frame. You see the edge of them in photographs. You hear their name once or twice in passing. They exist in the background of someone else's story, and that is exactly how they prefer it. Nancy Guthrie is one of those people. She is Savannah Guthrie's mother. And for most of the years that Savannah has been a household name. The familiar face on morning television, the calm voice during elections and crises, and the long, strange days of the news cycle. Nancy has remained almost entirely invisible to the public. That was a choice. Nancy grew up in a different America, one where you did not air your difficulties. You handled them at the kitchen table, behind closed doors, with a kind of quiet resolve that the current generation might not immediately recognize. You did not go looking for sympathy. You did not reach for a microphone. You simply kept going. She raised Savannah and her siblings after the family experienced one of its earliest and most defining ruptures. The sudden death of Savannah's father, Charles Guthrie, when Savannah was just a teenager. That loss reshaped everything. It pulled the family tighter in some ways, it left gaps in others. And it placed Nancy at the head of a household that had to reinvent itself almost overnight. She did what she had to do. She moved forward. She did not dwell, at least not publicly. And when Savannah's career began to rise, first in local news, then in the networks, then all the way to the Today Show, Nancy watched from a careful distance, proud but private. For a long time, that was the whole story. Devoted mother, quiet life, daughter who made it. But that framing, as comforting as it is, was always incomplete. Because somewhere behind it, there was a house. And inside that house, there were secrets that had been aging like something sealed in a jar, waiting for the moment someone finally had the courage to open it. Nancy is 84 now. And something shifted in her this year. Something that happens sometimes in the very last chapter of a long life. A kind of clarity arrives. A need to set the record straight before it is too late to set anything at all. She started talking, and the people who heard her were not entirely prepared for what she said. The property in question is not a mansion in the Hollywood sense. It is not gold-trimmed or ostentatious, but it carries a weight that simpler words fail to capture. It is the kind of home that signals something. Old trees along the front, rooms with high ceilings, a staircase that echoes. The kind of architecture that quietly announces that the people inside have history, whether they wanted that announcement or not. For years, this home was a source of stability for the Guthrie family, a constant in an otherwise shifting world. When Savannah's career took her to Washington, then to New York, then to the global stage, the house remained. When holidays arrived and the family needed a place to gather, the house was there. It was the anchor, the thread that connected all the separate lives back to a single shared point of origin. Nancy kept that anchor. She maintained the house, the routines, the invisible architecture of family that most people only notice when it disappears. And for a long time, everything looked stable. Savannah was thriving publicly. Her marriage, her later life, her 2 children, a career at the top of American television journalism, a face that millions of people trusted. From the outside, you would look at this family and see success. You would see resilience. You would see a widow who raised her children well and watched them flourish. But Nancy, sitting in that house, knew something different. She knew what had been decided without ever being fully discussed. She knew what had been signed and what had not been signed. She knew who had been told and who had been carefully kept in the dark. Not out of malice. That is important to understand, not out of cruelty. Out of love, in the way that love sometimes makes terrible decisions without realizing it is doing so. The quiet life looked perfect from the outside, but the inside of that house had its own weather, its own seasons. And for years, those seasons had been growing longer and darker without anyone acknowledging the change. There is a particular kind of family secret that is not really a secret at all in the technical sense. Everyone involved knows something happened. The documents exist. The decisions were made. But no one speaks it clearly, because speaking it clearly would require everyone to face what it actually meant. According to people familiar with the situation, questions surrounding the Guthrie family property had been present for longer than most realized. It began, as these things often do, with an estate matter, a question of inheritance, of ownership, of what belongs to whom when a family changes shape over time. Charles Guthrie's passing had left behind not just grief, but practical matters. The kind that quietly accumulate in the years following a loss, gathering interest and complexity the longer they go unaddressed. Nancy had handled what she could handle. She had made decisions the way any surviving parent makes decisions, in the fog of loss, with the information she had available, doing what seemed right at the time. But over the years, as Savannah's public life expanded, and as the family property gained a kind of symbolic significance that went beyond its square footage, those early decisions began to cast longer shadows. Reports suggest that certain arrangements made around the property were not fully communicated to all the people they affected, not because anyone intended harm, but because, in families, it is surprisingly easy to believe that the people you love understand things that you have never actually said out loud. That belief is almost always wrong. The first crack appeared quietly, a conversation that became an argument that became a silence, and then a silence that stretched across months, and then years, with everyone pretending it was just the ordinary distance that busy lives create. Nancy felt it. She knew where the crack was. She knew what had caused it. And she carried that knowledge the way elderly women sometimes carry the heaviest things, with remarkable composure, in full view of everyone, while no one thinks to ask what she is holding. A house is never just a house. People understand this on some level, but they rarely say it. When a family ties itself to a place for long enough, that place becomes a kind of external memory. It holds the shape of every gathering, every loss, every version of everyone who ever walked through its rooms. It becomes impossible to separate the physical structure from the emotional history stored inside it. This is what made the question of the Guthrie mansion so complicated. It was not, by all accounts, simply a legal dispute about property lines or square footage. It was a dispute about meaning, about what the house represented and to whom, about who had the right to make decisions about a space that had been the emotional center of multiple lives. According to sources close to the family, conversations about the property's future had taken place over several years. Conversations that, at times, went in directions that not everyone was comfortable with. Discussions about renovation, about potential sale, about what would happen to the house in the longer term. Nancy, as the matriarch, was at the center of those conversations. But being at the center of a conversation and having full control over its outcome are two entirely different things. And as time went on, she began to feel, according to those same sources, that decisions were being shaped by forces she had not fully anticipated when she first agreed to let them into the room. There were legal complexities. There were financial considerations. There were advisors involved and arrangements that she had, at certain points, trusted others to understand on her behalf. Trust is a beautiful thing. It is also, when misplaced, one of the most dangerous. She had been patient. She had told herself the situation would resolve. She had waited for the clarity to arrive on its own. It did not arrive on its own. And at 84, sitting in the house that had absorbed 4 decades of her family's life, Nancy Guthrie reached the point where patience felt less like a virtue and more like a surrender. There are moments in a person's life that are invisible from the outside but seismic from within. No cameras, no audience. Just a woman sitting in a room, with all the weight of everything she has ever known pressing down on her, and a sudden, irrevocable decision forming in her chest. Nancy's decision to speak was not dramatic. By several accounts, it was almost quiet. A phone call to someone she trusted, a few careful sentences, and then more sentences. And then, over the course of several conversations, a story that had been held in compression for years finally began to move. What she described, according to those who were present for those conversations, was not a simple story of wrongdoing. It was more complicated than that. It was a story about the way families accumulate unspoken agreements over decades, about the way trust, real trust, the kind built across a lifetime, can be leveraged without anyone ever calling it that. About the way an elderly parent can find herself in a situation she did not fully consent to, not because of any single dramatic event, but because of 100 small moments. Each one individually reasonable, that collectively added up to something that no longer felt right. She spoke about arrangements made on her behalf that she felt she had not fully understood at the time of their making. She raised questions, not accusations, but genuine, pressing questions, about the management of assets tied to the property, about decisions that had downstream effects she was not warned about conversations she had been told were necessary and routine, which had turned out to be neither. No official legal conclusion has been reached. No formal finding has been established. These are questions being raised, not charges being proven. But the questions themselves carry weight, because they come from an 84-year-old woman who has spent a lifetime choosing silence, who has sat through grief and reinvention, and the strange, sustained effort of watching a child become famous without ever once stepping into the spotlight herself. When a woman like that finally speaks, the question is not whether to listen. The question is whether you are prepared for what she has been carrying all this time. There is a particular burden that arrives when someone in a family becomes famous. It is not the burden you might expect. It is not jealousy in most cases. It is not resentment. It is something subtler. It is the way that fame changes the architecture of a family without anyone consenting to the renovation. Suddenly, the family home is not just a family home. It is a backdrop, a detail in a profile piece, a place with symbolic resonance for a public that has never set foot inside it but feels, somehow, that they have a stake in it. Decisions that would have been private, utterly unremarkable, become complicated by the public dimension of one member's life. Legal arrangements take on different textures when one party is a recognizable name. The ordinary messiness of family inheritance and property management gets filtered through a layer of image management and public narrative that the other family members never signed up for. Nancy never signed up for it either. She did not choose to become the mother of a public figure. She did not choose to have her home carry symbolic weight for an audience. She did not choose the particular pressures that arrived in her life when her daughter's face became known in every American household with a television set. She simply raised her children. She simply loved them. She simply lived in her house and tried to keep the anchor from drifting. And yet here she is, at 84, navigating questions that no mother should have to navigate. Questions that touch on trust, on autonomy, on the particular vulnerability of being old in a world that sometimes treats age as a diminishment of authority. Investigators have not concluded their inquiry. Official statements have been carefully limited. Savannah Guthrie, for her part, has not made public comment on the specific matters her mother has raised. And it would not be fair to draw conclusions about her role or her knowledge from silence alone. What can be said, what Nancy has now made impossible to unsay, is that the story of this family is more layered than the morning show image ever suggested. That the woman who sat quietly in the background had her own interior life, her own concerns, her own threshold for how long a secret could be kept before it started to cost more than it protected. That threshold has now been crossed, and the story that emerges from it is not simple. It is not scandalous in the tabloid sense. It is something more human than that, more difficult, more real. It is the story of what happens in the long, private years behind the public life, of what gets carried and by whom and for how long. and of the particular courage it takes for an old woman to look at everything she has protected and decide that the truth deserves more room than the secret. When we step back from the details, when we let the specific facts settle and stop pulling at us for a moment, what remains is something that feels familiar in a way that is almost uncomfortable. Because most of us know something about this. Not the mansion, not the public career, not the legal complexities that surround a high-profile family, but the other thing. The thing underneath all of that. The unspoken agreement. The decision that got made for us or around us while we were busy trusting the people who made it. The moment we realized that loving someone and understanding them are not the same thing. That being a family does not guarantee that everyone in it has the same version of the story. Nancy Guthrie spent most of her life in the background. She appears to have preferred it that way. And that preference, that commitment to quiet, is part of what makes her decision to speak so striking. It costs her something. It disrupts a peace she has worked very hard to maintain. It invites a kind of public attention she has spent decades successfully avoiding. And she did it anyway. That tells you something about how important this felt to her. About how long the wait had been building. About what it means when a person reaches the final chapter of their life and decides that the story, as it has been told, is missing something essential. There are no villains in the version of this story that seems most honest. There are people who made decisions under pressure, with incomplete information, shaped by competing loyalties and the specific distortions that fame and money introduce into ordinary family life. There are old agreements that stopped fitting new circumstances. There are people who trusted each other too completely in some areas and not enough in others. That is not a story about monsters. It is a story about how human beings, even the ones who love each other, can end up in rooms that feel nothing like what they intended. What happens next remains genuinely uncertain. Whether the questions Nancy has raised will find formal answers, whether the property matters will be resolved, whether the relationship between a mother and her famous daughter can hold all of this weight without fracturing, none of that has been determined yet. What has been determined is that silence has a shelf life, and for Nancy Guthrie that shelf life expired. She is 84 years old. She has lived a long and largely private life. She has held this particular story close for longer than most people hold anything. And now she has let it go, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in the way that people let things go when they have finally decided that the truth they are carrying belongs to history. Not to them alone. There is a kind of dignity in that, even when, especially when, the story is complicated and the ending has not yet been written. Stories like this one stay with you because they are not really about celebrities. They are about the private weight that every family carries. About what we protect and why, and when we finally decide it is time to let it go. If this story made you think about something in your own life, a silence, a secret, a question you have been holding, you are not alone in that. Leave a thought in the comments. We read every one. And if you want more stories like this, human, honest, and told with the care they deserve, subscribe and stay with us. We will be here.